It's a strange thing that when one begins to awaken, the world that once felt so familiar starts to feel a little distant, almost like a stage you can no longer play on. You sit among people, you hear the same laughter, the same complaints, the same rehearsed lines of what life is supposed to be about. And yet, something in you no longer dances to that rhythm. It's not that you've become antisocial or superior. No, nothing of the sort. It's simply that the old music, the small talk, the gossip, the endless debates about who's right and who's wrong, no longer holds any melody for you. You begin to sense that much of what we call connection is actually an exchange between masks, between egos defending their little territories of identity. And when you see through that, the game loses its charm. You no longer feel the need to prove, to persuade, to perform. You realize that real communication happens not through words, but through presence. And presence is a rare language. Most people are too busy thinking of what to say next to ever listen. So naturally, the awake person finds themselves drifting, not away from people, but from pretense. You stop resonating with the noise because silence has become your new home. And that silence, that stillness, begins to reveal a different kind of companionship, not based on agreement or validation, but on being. So yes, awakening creates distance, but it's a holy distance, the kind that gives space for truth to breathe. You still love the world, perhaps even more deeply than before, but you no longer cling to it for meaning, because now you see that meaning is what you are. It's rather fascinating, you see, that as one becomes more awake, the desire for crowds begins to fade, and in its place grows a longing for depth. Not more people, but more presence. You start to see that most human interactions are built upon a quiet desperation to be seen, to be liked, to be validated, and yet this very need keeps us from newly meeting each other. The spiritually awake person begins to sense that truth is not found in numbers, nor in applause, but in the rare stillness between two souls who have no masks left to wear. They no longer crave popularity because they've touched something more real than approval. They've tasted the sacred intimacy of authenticity. When you see life as a mirror of consciousness, you no longer wish to surround yourself with echoes that merely flatter the ego. Instead, you look for voices that speak from the depths of being, from silence, from honesty. It becomes less about who will stand beside you and more about who can stand within truth with you. And such souls are few, for most are too entangled in the performance of self to see beyond it. So, the awake person learns to be content with the quiet company of truth, even if that means walking alone. It's not loneliness, but a kind of spiritual refinement, the understanding that depth can only be shared with those who've dared to dive. The world may see it as isolation, but to the awakened, it is communion of a higher order. They find friendship not in frequency of contact, but in the resonance of understanding, for even one honest soul in tune with truth is worth more than 1,000 voices echoing emptiness. There's something profoundly mysterious about what happens when one's consciousness begins to shift. It's not something you do, it's something that happens to you, like a frequency tuning itself to a new wavelength. And as this happens, you start to notice that the energy around you, the people, the conversations, the environments that once felt so normal, begin to feel strangely heavy, out of tune, as though you're listening to a song that no longer plays in your key. It's not that others are wrong or lesser, but that you no longer vibrate at the same tempo of illusion, the endless chase for status, the obsession with possessions, the need to defend a fragile sense of self. You can feel it. Immediately, when someone is still caught in that game, their words carry the echo of fear, of competition, of needing to prove something that deep down they don't believe. The awake person senses this dissonance not with judgment but with compassion, because they too once played that tune, but now they can't go back to it. Not because they've outgrown people, but because they've outgrown the illusion that used to bind them. It's as though you've stepped out of a noisy marketplace into a vast silent forest, and suddenly the noise feels unbearable to return to. The mismatch is energetic, not personal. When consciousness expands, the old vibrations of greed, pride, and fear simply don't resonate anymore. So naturally, the awake person drifts towards stillness, toward others who hum with that same quiet frequency of truth. It's not rejection, it's resonance. Just as a tuning fork vibrates only with matching notes, so too the awakened soul finds harmony only with those who have begun to awaken to the same timeless melody of being. It's a curious paradox, isn't it? That the world we live in celebrates individuality on the surface, yet secretly fears it when it actually appears. Society, in its quiet and subtle way, rewards those who conform, who play their part in the grand theater of consensus reality. From the moment we are born, we are taught what is true, what is proper, what is acceptable, and the moment someone dares to question that, not out of rebellion, but out of genuine curiosity, they become a disturbance in the system. You see, most people are deeply invested in the stories they've been told, because those stories give them comfort, give them identity, give them the illusion of control. So when someone begins to ask questions like, what if reality isn't what we think it is? What if the self I believe in is just a construct? It shakes the foundations of the collective dream. People don't like that kind of disturbance. It's unsettling. It's like switch-ing on the light in a dark room. Everyone squints, blinks, and tells you to turn it off. Spiritually awake person, however, cannot go back to sleep. Once you've seen that much of what passes for reality is just a social agreement, a shared illusion maintained by fear of standing alone, you begin to live differently. But in doing so, you inevitably unsettle those who still find safety in the script. They look at you with suspicion, as though you've broken some invisible rule. And in a sense, you've stopped pretending. Society doesn't quite know what to do with those who stop pretending, because the entire machinery of culture runs on pretense, on wanting to be liked, wanting to belong, wanting to be seen as normal. But the awake person realizes that normal is just another word for numb, and so they step outside the current, not to rebel against it, but because they can no longer float with it. They see the game being played and smile gently at those still lost in it. Shh. They don't condemn the sleepers, they simply understand that truth can't be forced. And so they walk quietly, carrying the strange peace of someone who no longer needs the world's permission to be real. It's a remarkable thing, really, how frightened people are of silence. You can watch it in any room. The moment there's a pause, someone clears their throat, checks their phone, turns on the television, anything to avoid that vast and open quiet. Because in silence, there's nothing to distract you from yourself. And that, for most people, is terrifying. The awakened person, however, begins to see silence as sacred, as the very womb of existence itself. In stillness, they discover that all things arise, every sound, every thought, every breath. It's not emptiness in the way we think of it, it's fullness so complete that it doesn't need to announce itself. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of awareness. When you sit in it long enough, you start to hear something deeper than words, the rhythm of life itself, the heartbeat of the cosmos pulsing through every leaf, every ripple of wind, every flicker of light. The awakened have stopped fearing silence because they've realized that it's not something outside of them. It's what they are. When the noise of the mind quiets, what remains is not a void, but a vast, living stillness that holds everything effortlessly. But to most people, that stillness feels like death, because their sense of self is built on motion, on doing, achieving, talking, proving. The ego feeds on noise, it survives in distraction. That's why people rush to fill every gap with chatter or sound. Yet, the moment you stop running from silence and let it envelop you, something extraordinary happens. The illusion of separation begins to dissolve. You start to feel that the same quiet space that exists between sounds also exists between you and the world. And in that realization, the boundaries fade. The awakened person no longer seek constant stimulation because they have found the beauty of stillness, a peace that doesn't depend on music or conversation or even thought. They rest in the awareness that everything arises from silence and returns to it, that silence is not the background of life, but its very essence. And so what others fear as emptiness, they know as the divine presence itself, gentle, infinite, and always here. It's an uncomfortable thing, truth. Not because it's cruel or violent, but because it has a strange way of stripping away everything we've built to protect ourselves. You see, most people don't actually want to see reality. They want comfort, reassurance, something to hold on to. So they build masks, they create roles, they rehearse little performances of who they think they should be. But when someone walks into the room who sees through all that, who isn't fooled by the act, it can feel deeply unsettling. It's as if their very presence exposes the fragile scaffolding upon which others have constructed their identities. The spiritually awake don't necessarily intend to unsettle anyone. They simply see too clearly. They've looked behind the curtain and found that the actor and the mask are the same illusion. And once you've seen that, you can't pretend anymore. But those who are still asleep, who live in the dream of roles and appearances, feel a kind of threat in that gaze, not because they are being judged, but because they sense their illusions beginning to tremble. Truth has that effect. It doesn't argue, it doesn't demand, it simply is, and its presence alone can shake the foundations of a carefully curated life. People say they want honesty, but what they usually mean is, tell me the truth, as long as it doesn't disturb my story. And when the awakened speak or even exist outside of that shared dream, the contrast becomes unbearable. It's like shining a light into eyes too long accustomed to darkness. The ego resists, fights, mocks, or withdraws, anything to avoid that piercing simplicity. But those who see, who have faced themselves without flinching, can no longer wear the same masks, can no longer play the same games. They don't judge those who still do. They simply know what's real. And this knowing, this quiet clarity, radiates in a way that reveals, not through accusation, but through presence, the deep falseness of what passes for normal. That's why truth feels dangerous, because it invites you to die before you die, to let the false self crumble, so that something authentic may finally breathe. But until one is ready for that death, truth will always look like a threat rather than a liberation. It's a curious thing, really. When you meet someone who has shed their masks, someone who no longer hides behind the endless performance of ego, it does something strange to you. Without even realizing it, you begin to feel slightly naked in their presence. Not because they're judging you or analyzing you, but because their very being lacks something you've been avoiding in yourself. The ego, you see, is a master of disguise. It builds identities out of opinions, fears, possessions, and social approval. It whispers, "This is who you are," while constantly keeping you busy maintaining the illusion. But when you stand before someone who has stepped out of that game, who no longer needs to prove, compare, or control, your ego begins to tremble. It senses danger, not physical but existential, because what it's being shown silently is what freedom actually looks like. And that freedom threatens everything the ego depends on. It's as if a mirror has been placed before you, one that doesn't flatter or distort, but reflects you as you are, without pretense, without the story. Most people can't bear that reflection for long. They'll fidget, change the subject, even feel irritation toward the awakened one, because unconsciously they're being reminded of how much of their life is still being lived as a performance. Authenticity has a strange power. It doesn't need to persuade anyone. It simply is. And that very isness reveals the falseness in everything around it. The ego, feeling exposed, reacts defensively. It might project judgment. He's arrogant, she's strange, they think they're better than us. But in truth, what it's reacting to is its own insecurity. The light of authenticity doesn't condemn the shadows. It merely makes them visible. And for those still clinging to their masks, that visibility feels unbearable. Yet that discomfort is the invitation, the crack where awakening can begin. Because to feel exposed is the first step toward realizing that what's being threatened was never who you truly were. It's the false self trembling before the truth of your own being, waiting, terrified yet longing, to dissolve into the peace it once feared. There's a great misunderstanding in the world that when someone becomes detached, when they step away from the noise, the crowd, or the endless char, for validation, they've somehow grown cold or arrogant. But that isn't detachment at all. True detachment isn't a wall. It's freedom. It's the quiet realization that you no longer need to be constantly affirmed by others to know who you are. Most people spend their lives like mirrors facing other mirrors, endlessly reflecting opinions, judgments, and borrowed emotions, desperately searching for some reflection that feels like truth. But the spiritually awake one sees through that hall of mirrors. They understand that depending on others to tell you your worth is like standing in the rain waiting for someone else to hold up an umbrella. So they simply step out. They stop depending, not out of pride, but out of peace. They stop needing applause because they've discovered that the stillness within them is more satisfying than any noise outside. And this confuses people, especially those who equate attention with affection or silence with superiority. But real detachment is compass, ion in its purest form. It says, I love you, but I don't need you to make me whole. It allows space for yourself and for others to be exactly as they are. The awakened one doesn't push the world away. They simply stop clutching at it. They flow with it the way a leaf flows down a river, present, aware, but not grasping. And that absence of grasping feels like rejection to those still caught in the drama of needing to be needed. Yet it's not rejection at all. It's release. When you no longer depend on approval, you can finally love without fear. You can speak truth without trying to impress. You can walk alone without feeling lonely. Detachment, then, is not separation from life. It's immersion in it without losing yourself. It's standing in the storm yet remaining untouched by it. It's knowing that peace isn't found in the noise of acceptance, but in the silence of understanding. And that silence, once you've heard it, becomes the deepest kind of love, one that doesn't cling, because it's already complete. It's a strange and almost tender thing to realize that very few will truly understand you once you awaken. Not because you've grown superior or mysterious, but because awakening changes the language you speak, not with words, but with being. Most friendships, you see, are built upon subtle agreements of illusion. We agree to play our roles, the funny one, the loyal one, the successful one, the broken one. We wear these masks not out of deceit, but because they make interaction smoother, safer. But when awareness dawns, when you begin to see through the masks, yours and others, you find it increasingly difficult to participate in those silent performances. You can't unsee the truth once it's seen. You notice how people talk not to communicate, but to defend their identities. How affection often disguises fear of being alone. How connection can sometimes mean shared ignorance rather than shared understanding. And when you stop feeding that illusion, many quietly drift away. It isn't tragic, it's natural, like mist dissolving when the sun rises. The spiritually awake don't mourn that loss. They accept it with a kind of serene gratitude. They understand that friendship built on illusion cannot survive truth. And that's not a failure, it's simply transformation. You cannot stay in shallow waters when your soul longs for the depths. So they walk alone, but not lonely. They rest in a deeper companionship, one with existence itself. They find company in silence, comfort in solitude, and communion in the small, wordless moments where life reveals itself as whole. They stop searching for people who understand them and start living in a way that doesn't require understanding. And in that peace, something extraordinary happens. Those few who do understand appear, not by effort, but by resonance. The universe gently rearranges itself so that truth meets truth, depth meets depth. It's no longer about numbers or belonging to a group. It's Abu. T vibration, alignment. So the awakened one doesn't chase connection anymore. They simply remain open, knowing that whatever stays is real, and whatever leaves was never meant to stay. Few will understand, and that's okay, because truth was never meant for the many. It was always meant for those ready to see.